Hello, I'm Taeha, and welcome back to another video. In light of the recent events that have been happening in our community, check out my monthly news videos if you haven't. I wanted to hopefully open up some healthy discussions regarding aspects of our hobby that we can change for the better so that we can prevent future Mechs Co situations. As keyword creators or influencers, whatever you want to call us, have become more prolific in our space, I think it's also important that we start to use our platforms in times like these. So today I'll be joined by rmendis, a community member as well as a moderator of the Mech Market Discord, to just chat about group buys and as well as how we ended up in the situation that we are in today. I mean, I know who you are, rmendis, but I'm sure a lot of my viewers probably, there's a good chance they don't know the legendary rmendis. So if you can just give an introduction to yourself, your involvement and I guess time during the hobby.
I'm not super well known. It's by no means a legend.
rmendis is definitely a legendary name in the hobby, I would say.
So I started the hobby, late 2016. So not as long as some of the hardcore veterans, but I think longer than most now, since most of the hobby growth, I think, were really in the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. And I started. I was looking for a buckling spring keyboard when I was doing a build, and I wanted to have this keyboard that I remember from the 80s. And I discovered, Desk Authority and Geek Hack, and that was the end of it for me. I fell down the rabbit hole. As you know, I fell hard into artisans, but I also have of course, affinity for keyboards, and I have way too many keyboards. Is probably just like I have way too many artisans, but yeah. So I've been around since then. I ended up becoming a mod since I'm in the artisan community, I'm a mod on several maker community discords. But I also became a mod, I guess, maybe a couple of years ago on the Discord Discord Mech Market.
Okay. Oh, I had no idea you were a Discord or mod there. So.
Yeah. So it's not affiliated with Reddit Mech Market. Unfortunately, right. People think it is because the name is the same, but it's not affiliated. And it's probably the biggest Discord marketplace. Mm. And so, yeah, I'm a moderator there and on some artisan keyboards. So I'm not affiliated with Reddit. I'm not a moderator on Reddit. I don't work with any vendors. I don't have any financial interest in any vendors. So just a disclosure there. Hopefully at some point I'd love to do a key set, with a vendor at some point and do something maybe based on the artisan website. But yeah, mm-hmm. That's my background.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And for anyone who watching, if you guys do ever end up meeting rmendis in person at a meetup, make sure you guys check out the trays of artisans he brings. There's usually at least like 3 or 4 trays just filled with artisans.
The trays
not trays, yeah.
Praise of shame. I saw your video on Mechs Co. It's a big talk in the hobby, and we knew this would. When I say we knew, we knew that this was happening probably earlier than some of the public, and the reason is, and this is what's happened to Mechs Co. is not new, unfortunately. So, as anyone who's been around since the early days has seen vendors come and go and have seen good and bad happen. I've been involved in helping other moderators write PSAs about vendors that are going under, or individual hobbyists who are struggling to fulfill group buys, whether it's keyboards or other things, and it happens, and so I saw your post on I know it's a short post, and I think it's great that you kind of are giving through your platform that you have and a great audience, let people know about it. But I think as I mentioned when we were talking earlier, I think there was the community used to be much smaller back then, right? And right. When people joined it, they would end up doing their own research and things, and it was less accessible perhaps than it is today. People discover it through Twitch and YouTube and Instagram and all these modern platforms, where in the old days, like when I discovered it was through Geek Hack and Desk Authority, granted very boomerish, you had to dig and you had to learn. It wasn't easy to join a group buy or things like that, right? And as a result, you sort of implicitly knew the inherent risks involved in those things, right? And today, because there's so much accessibility and availability is great, but what people may not understand is that risk hasn't gone away. So
Right.
there's this veneer or facade of legitimacy, right? And it's not that the vendors are illegitimate, but the vendors carry as much risk as it used to be in the old days. And people just don't know that, right? They see a website, right? They think this is like, oh, it's like drop. It must be perfectly safe to go and give, buy 10 GBs from this vendor, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not the case with all the vendors. And we'll talk about it. But yeah, I think it's a good opportunity for people to use this as a learning, right? As a lesson, sort of a learning opportunity to not just the hobbyists, but vendors and, potentially future vendors who want to, get into the business in this hobby of, things to be aware of, practices, things like that, right?
Mhm. So I know the moderators kind of had a post recently on they kind of locked down what kind of posts are allowed to be posted,
Yeah.
and
On that
I
was on RMK, right? Not
yes,
right, yeah, yeah.
and I have heard through the grapevines they're maybe trying to help put some sort of system in place that might some kind of way to vet vendors. I don't know if you had
Right.
any thing more you could share on that you could
Yeah, so we'll
potentially.
talk about it. So first of all, I think their reaction to kind of pause group buy promotion is not based purely on the fact that they're trying to figure out what the fallout is from the Mechs Co situation. Because
Hmm.
if you've been following it, unfortunately, it wasn't a small vendor in terms of the number of GBs they were running. They
Right.
had multiple concurrent keyboard GBs, multiple concurrent key set GBs from multiple vendors, and it's a bit of a mess, right? And
Yeah.
so there's actually like it's almost like this like a bank run, right? Like if you have one bank fail, right, all of a sudden people may lose faith in others, and you could have this sort of like cascading effects of chargebacks that could really create a domino effect that's negative for the community. So they wanted to just pause things to figure out what's going on with with Mechs Co. And to their credit and the credit of other vendors, they're trying to figure out if things can be salvaged.
All right.
So they're trying to coordinate with other vendors to see if they can pick up some of the unfulfilled GBs from Mechs Co. And so that takes time. And so what they're trying to do, first of all, I don't think it's a great time to be promoting GBs right now anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So, and if somebody really wants to, they still can. They can go to GeekHack or whatever and still do it. I think these guys, on RMK decided, hey, let's just pause for a moment and see if we can figure out, like, let's see if we can limit the damage, right? The collateral damage of this. So I know it seems, on the surface like, oh, these guys are power tripping and stuff like that. But I'm not a mod there, but I know some of them, and I can say it's not the case that they're trying to do, power trip or anything like that.
Mhm.
And they haven't paused it to try and set standards or anything. I think they've paused it simply to see if they can mitigate some of the fallout from this, right?
Right.
Because it's unknown. Like a lot of it is unknown. Like you don't know what's really going to happen. For example, is there a proxy, right, that was working on some of those key sets that's also going to fail, right? And so I think they're doing the diligent thing by pausing. I don't think it hurts anyone by pausing promotion of GBs, right? Vendors again can still run it if they want. They have their own discords and other channels of marketing. And I think it also speaks to another thing, Taeha, where like there's this entitlement of vendors who are now making a lot of money to a free marketing channel as if they're entitled to it, right?
Mm.
And we have to step back and understand, like, if you're a business, right, the way things work in the real world is you have to pay for a marketing channel. Vendors are very fortunate that they have a model where, and we'll talk about this in a moment, not only do they get free money, interest-free money from the community, but they get free marketing. There's virtually no investment capital they have to put up, right? And so it's interesting to see, like, as soon as, for a well-intentioned pause of this thing, like people are up in arms around, oh, you're not allowing us to promote our stuff. It's like, you're not entitled to that channel, right? Like if you want to go buy a sponsored post on Reddit, go ahead and buy it through Reddit, but you're not entitled to free marketing, right?
Right.
So I think it also kind of exposes a little bit of this kind of entitlement that some vendors have. And I know some vendors are going to get upset perhaps for me to saying it, but that is the reality. Like if you want to advertise, right, a group buy, go buy this advertisement on Reddit. Right? You're not entitled to free marketing. We'll talk about in a moment kind of like the other thing you mentioned of, trying to create some standards or things like that. But before we do that, I thought if I can share my screen, I'd like to.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow,
So
this is a
let's
professional.
yeah let's well,
Okay.
I think this helps me talk through it at least, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
let's take, I think this is is going to be beneficial. And I apologize for the viewers on your side who are veterans and know this stuff already, and I might not be explaining it perfectly. Look, this is for the probably 90% of the community now, right?
Hmm.
That is relatively new and have not, are not deeply steeped in it. They're more casual, right? They want a nice keyboard for their home, whatever, right? So group buys, right? The concept of what a group buy is, and I want to caveat that all of the discussion that we're having now is specific to the group buy model, right? Some vendors, purchase inventory and sell it on their website or pre-purchase or whatever. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about a specific business model, which is a group buy, right?
If I may
And
ask really quickly,
yep.
do you consider the pre-order nuance different in this case, or are you still lumping that pre-order nuance under group buys for
I
this
think that
discussion?
it's a good question. I think pre-order is sort of like, I guess what you would consider buying a product at a later stage of a group buy, right?
Hmm.
Before it's fulfilled, but much later than when you're doing the initial purchase, right?
Right. Yeah.
So let's park that for a moment. I would say it's sort of a
Okay.
subset of a group buy, right?
Okay.
But that's a good question. It's a good question, right? So and there's actually an interesting, you know, the pre-order concept is relatively new in the hobby, and
Hmm.
it's I think an offshoot of something potentially negative, right? There's pros and cons to it. We'll talk about it in a little bit, okay? So
Yeah.
let's take a trip back in time to what was a group buy initially intended for, right? So if you go back to like 2016 or earlier, right, there were very few manufacturers catering to the mechanical keyboard hobby, right?
Hmm.
And very few vendors. So if you wanted to build a custom keyboard or get a key set made with custom colors, your options were super limited, right? You would
Right.
have to basically, um, you had a few manufacturers like GM Key, Signature Plastics, et cetera. They were primarily doing business for commercial clients,
Hmm.
building esoteric key sets, or sorry, generic key sets, right? If you wanted to build a custom key set, you as an individual hobbyist would come up with a design, right? And I think one of the earlier ones was Dolce or something like that, but you come up with a color design. Then you would go to your fellow hobbyists, and back then we're talking like less than $250,000, right? As you went back earlier, it was a huge drop, like less than 100K, less than 10K people, right?
Yeah.
So you'd go to your fellow hobbyists. They all generally mostly knew who you were because it was a small community, and you had only a couple of platforms to do this in, right? Maybe Reddit, Geek Hack, and Desk Authority primarily, right? And you'd run an interest check, and you'd say, "Hey, I'd really like to do this key set. Who wants to join me?" Right? And if you got enough interest and you tweak the feedback enough, eventually people will say, "Yeah, I'll be willing to join you in this buy." Right? And they basically, like, you'd open up a Google form, and you'd literally collect their money that way, right? And they all understood, well, shit, I may never see this $200 again or whatever, right? And that hobbyist would then go to GMK and he'd place an order, and he said, "Look, I've collected enough money, I can buy this product and pay you to do it." And you get into a queue. And generally speaking, at that time, these were not long queues, right? So it was usually within the refund window of a credit card, sometimes even within the refund window of PayPal, right?
Well, if assuming you're using standard GMK colors, right? If you're
Assuming
using
you're using
custom,
standard, right?
yeah.
But
Okay.
I'm talking generally like keyboards, key sets. Like, yes, some things would take longer than a year, but there were some things that did take less than a year, or
Right.
in some cases they would like recollect the funds or something, right? So to
Right.
keep you
Right.
within that, right? Because
Hmm.
there was more shared risk, right?
Right.
Or at least more known risk, right? So this was, by and large, and yes, there's some slight variances, but generally speaking, this was the intent of what a group buy was, right? The intent of a group buy was, there's no commercial vendors serving the hobby. As individual hobbyists, we have to pool our money together, run a group buy, fulfill it, and then send it out, right? And by the way, I think it's interesting for people to know, in the early days, like GMK keycaps, they didn't come in these sorted key sets, right? Or cases.
Right.
They would have to be literally sorted by the hobbyists.
Right.
right?
I mean, some of them still haven't shipped, so.
Yeah, exactly. They're still
Yeah.
sorting. They're
Right.
still
Yes.
sorting.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a great situation, but that was the intent of a group buy. Okay, that was the intent of a group buy. Now, fast forward to like 2020 and beyond, and you saw massive growth in the hobby, right? You saw massive growth in the hobby, and commercial businesses sprung up. Granted, generally created by hobbyists, okay, but commercial businesses nonetheless, LLC, S corps, whatever, that sprung up and said, hey, this is a pretty good model. We can actually turn this into a real business and generate some real money, right? We're not creating key sets just for us to enjoy, but we're going to create a business for a for-profit motive. And guess what? We're going to get free marketing. Okay, we're not going to spend $1 in marketing. We're going to get free marketing, and the market now is big, right? There's like over 1 million subs on RMK, right? Interesting points of fact. At one point, it had more subs than our Lego. Think about that.
RMK did?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, that I did not know.
Yeah. So
That's crazy.
it's consistently, like, it was one of the fastest growing subs on Reddit. It was one of the most active subs on Reddit. Like, so our hobby, thanks to folks like you and others who've done a great job promoting it, has grown. And this is a great thing. And, unlike in the old days where you had to, like, your choices were like limited to certain key sets and you had to wait for like 3 months between them and all those things, availability and accessibility is amazing now. Right? And so these commercial businesses sprung up and they're like, hey, let's get free marketing and market these things. And we're going to put up websites, right? And collect this like we're a real business, right? And to hobbyists coming into the hobby who didn't live in this old school boomer era of a group buy, this essentially looked like a normal business that just happened to take a longer time to deliver. Now, in some cases, much longer than a year. And so you had people coming in many of whom didn't really understand the underlying model of the group buy, where essentially all of the risk is on them, right? Even though they're transacting with what appears to be a legitimate business that will fulfill, right? And because this is no longer an individual hobbyist just trying to like get his buddies together to get a key set, these guys are for profit. They started running these in parallel, collecting more and more and more money. Now, if the intent and the way that these guys run the business is good, no problem with this model. Okay. Yeah, you can overextend yourself sometimes, but generally speaking, you're going to be careful with the money. When you collect group buy funds in advance, you're going to set some aside that you got to leave for the shipping. You're going to make sure you've got some buffer, et cetera, et cetera. But this model of generating profit with virtually no investment tempted many people to open up a vendor. And some of those people did not follow good practices.
Right.
Okay. Mechs Co, the one in particular we're talking about, at one point had something like 30, 40 simultaneous unfulfilled GBs, and they hadn't delivered on one yet.
30, 40. Okay.
Don't quote me on the exact. They've definitely had 30, 40 open at one time.
That's
I think
crazy.
I can't remember how many they've had open prior to when they started fulfilling. Now, again, it's not to say that they intended to scam people. Okay. Their intent was good. They came from the hobby. People knew them, and we'll talk about that as another problem, by the way. But over time, they mismanage funds, and part of the way you can mismanage it is when you collect. So here's another thing that happened during the boom time. Okay, there's this concept again that casual people may not know. When you place an order with a manufacturer for a key set, for example, there's something called a minimum order quantity, right? You can't buy, like, let's say only 50 people want a key set. You can't place an order for 50. There's a minimum of, say, I don't know, let's pick a number, 250 that you have to order.
Right.
Okay. And the point of a group buy and an interest check is to make sure that you have enough demand to hit at least the minimum. Okay. Now, what was happening in the boom time with, let's say, less scrupulous or careful vendors is they would run a group buy and there wouldn't be enough demand to hit the minimum order quantity. Maybe they would only sell 100, right? Or have commitment for 100 and they need to get to 250. They were taking the profits from that 100 and in some cases their own money and putting it into the group buy to hit the minimum order quantity, assuming that when the product was finally available, they would be able to sell out and make even more profit on those extras through what you mentioned, pre-orders. So this concept of a pre-order was created where the vendors would bridge the gap to hit the minimum order quantity, either with the profits from the people who paid initially or their own money or a combination of the two, then start essentially extending the group buy into a pre-order phase and hoping that they would sell out then. If not, they would sell out by the time they get the product in store and be able to sell it because people were willing to buy when it was in stock. The problem is demand did not grow forever. And so in this downturn, businesses or vendors that were over leveraged, right, with too much stock and not enough cash, were unable to complete the fulfillment of these group buys. And some vendors like Mechs Co that had multiple concurrent group buys were so over leveraged and mismanaged the funds so badly that they simply collapsed. And they're not going to be the last one to collapse, right? And they weren't the first one to collapse. It's not to say that there's many other Mechs Co's out there, but it's worth looking at, if people knew, okay, if people knew that what they were doing was not sustainable, how come it wasn't caught? And I consider this a failure of it's a shared responsibility we have, right? As vendors, as streamers like yourself, as platform moderators and administrators, right? We all share a responsibility in this, right? When times are good, everyone's, it's the wild, wild west of let's all make money and it's endless supply of cash and blah, 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 right? But when you don't have these checks and balances and the demand dries up is when things, start to hit the fan. And if you look at, so you've got, free marketing, free capital, no oversight. Right? You've created an environment where you can have people come in, again, perhaps with good intent, but poor business experience, and put themselves and their customers in a situation where they're doomed to fail if demand dries up. And one of the problems is the culture of our hobby, right? We're all very tight-knit, we're all friends, we like to support each other, there's mutual symbiosis and all this stuff is, we are, it's created good camaraderie, right? But at the same time, it's created a lot of lack of accountability. So for example, we talked to some vendors. Many vendors felt, because they knew the business well, that what Mechs Co was doing was unsustainable. They knew they would collapse at some point. But if you're a vendor, you can't really, you will lose credibility and cause drama if you go out and start bad-mouthing one of your competitors, right? So you can't even speak about the fact that this vendor is doing something risky. There's no system, there's no ombudsman or somebody neutral that they can go to and say, hey, there's potentially, you should look into this vendor, what they're doing seems unsustainable, right? There's no private channel for them to do that, okay? Second problem, many vendors are run by people who have personal relationships with the very customers that are giving them the money. And as a hobby culture, we're pretty cultish around defending our friends, right? Designers are friends with vendors, vendors are friends with the brands, right? Vendors spend money with streamers, streamers are friends. So it's a tightly knit group and nobody wants to throw their friends under the bus, right? And so even if you know there could be a problem, you don't want to throw your friend under the bus. You're going to hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then, Manufacturers, now this is an interesting one. Manufacturers, they may have direct visibility into the financial problems with a vendor. Like a vendor may have not paid them for a group buy that's already run, but they're not really involved in or communicate directly with the community, and they're also bound by contractual confidentiality, right? So GMK may have known, well, shit, I haven't been paid for the last 3 GBs from Mechs Co, right? Even though Mechs Co has collected the money. They can't really say anything. Okay? Then you have designers. Now, designers are working closely with the vendors, but they have financial ties to the vendors. It's not in their financial interest to throw a vendor under the bus or raise an alarm. So another person that may have visibility into potential problems is not financially incentivized to disclose them, or may be limited contractually to disclose those problems. Then you have influencers who maybe are close to the vendor and they know problems are happening, but they may have financial interest in those brands. And they don't want to cause drama. Their job is to influence the community and talk about all the great stuff that's happening. Why do they want to talk about a potential vendor that's about to fail, but without any facts or data to back it up? They can't really do that, right?
Right.
And so you have like this community of vendors, manufacturers, designers, influencers, and then moderators have no transparency, right? And every time they try and do something, everyone accuses them of overstepping their bounds. So any public warnings they could provide are too late. They're after the fact warnings. Because if they try and proactively do it, people jump on them because they're defending their friends, right? So you've got this perfect storm of zero accountability, zero oversight, with unlimited interest-free, risk-free loans and free marketing that allows a Mechs Co situation to happen, right, and fail. And people saw it happening. They knew it was going to happen, but, I don't want to go into the details of it, but due to this situation, there are a lot of barriers to raising alarms. And there's no formal vetting of vendors. Anyone can become a vendor. Anyone can post a group buy. There's no centralized reporting when vendors go under, and we've seen dozens. There's no centralized reporting of it. You got to go research, right? And there are no guidelines or expectations of how vendors should run group buys. Even if I'm a vendor with great intent, I sort of have to figure out on my own, hey, how do I communicate, right? What's the right amount of money I should put aside in escrow, right? How long does it usually take? What are the problems? What are the best practices? There's no guidance, right? So you basically have a perfect storm. In some ways, we should be surprised that there aren't more Mechs and Co's or it didn't happen earlier.
Yeah.
So when you peel this onion back, I know it's easy to look and, cast aspersions on Mechs Co and cast aspersions on moderators that are trying to pause group buys for a minute. But this is an environment that allows houses of cards to be created.
For sure. I just want to clarify one thing, which might have come off as a misunderstanding in my video. I wasn't necessarily trying to insinuate that moderators are power tripping. It was more so I like that they are stepping in and trying to actively figure this out. And I also am personally for some kind of vetting of vendors if some kind of system can be created. It was just so I wanted to raise a concern that should this happen, I think there also needs to be a check for these moderators.
100%.
Currently, we don't even know how RMK mods are elected right now, right?
100%. And they're not elected. They're not elected.
Right.
So,
yeah, it was just more so to put that out there that, I want to have a healthy discussion on how we can modernize and make it better for the hobbyists.
And what you're bringing up is actually a separate issue, okay, that I believe is an issue unrelated to vendors, which is our communities have now grown to be pretty big, okay? And there's, how do I say this? If you have financial interest in the community, your access to platforms is critical, right? You need to access Reddit and Geekhack or, Discord platforms or whatever. And today, and this is just how the hobby's grown up, moderators are a voluntary position, a thankless one, but voluntary nonetheless.
Most places, moderators are unpaid.
Most places, yeah. And there's no formal training or vetting or any of that stuff. I mean, generally there's informal vetting based on usually you have to be a known person and all that stuff, right? But there's no, there's also no ombudsman role or meta moderator concept where if you have a problem with the moderator, who do you go to, right? Or if you, and I have talked to moderators to be very careful of this, is to do cross bands of people, you have to have really good reasons to do it and have hard facts and things like that, because there are no formal channels to raise issues or make appeals and stuff like that, right? So what you're bringing up is absolutely a valid, issue that as the hobby has grown, maybe we need more formalization of moderators and mod appeal processes and meta mods and ombudsman. All of those things are absolutely fair, right?
Yeah.
Completely unrelated to this issue.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to clarify.
Yep.
I wasn't trying to say that the moderators are power tripping right now. I'm all for them.
I'm saying that in general. I'm saying that in general. Moderators do get accused of power tripping. I've seen it. I'll give you my own example. Okay, so there was a vendor called SantiGo Customs. Okay, started as a cable manufacturer, fulfilled some stuff. Again, never with bad intent. I don't want to disparage the intent of these people. Generally speaking, right? People start these businesses with good intent, right? Mm-hmm. Many of them are friends of people, and it goes back to that's why it's so hard to raise alarms early, is because the intent is good and they are friends from the hobby. So it's not with bad intent, right? And I don't think these people intend to scam people and stuff like that, right? I think because of overwhelming circumstances that they've created for themselves, it ends up happening, right? And so SantiGo Customs, right, fulfilled some cable group buys. Some people liked them, some people didn't get them. The quality was questionable, whatever. Ran a group buy for a product called the Lyra, hasn't fulfilled yet. Started a new group buy for another keyboard called the Monoflex, even though the Lyra was in trouble, visible to everybody, right? And I went personally to. I said, look, I can see the train wreck, okay? And if I don't say anything, I'm being a bad person, right? I haven't given what I know, the information I know, to my fellow community members. They can make the judgment call themselves on whether or not they want to listen to me or what they do with the info. But if I don't disclose it, I'm a bad community member. I was in the Lyra GB, I saw it. So I went into his thing and I warned the Monoflex people. I said, listen, this guy hasn't fulfilled this other GB. We've had plenty of complaints through the Reddit, mech market that he's got issues on his cable GBs too. Please be careful. You're way past the, you're about to hit the refund limit date on credit cards. Please consider it. And the amount of vitriol directed at me and the names was ridiculous, right? Oh. So even if a moderator or somebody tries to raise the issue with valid data, right? It's not like speculative, valid data. There's an immediate, it's like an antibody reaction. Why? Because nobody wants to believe that. Nobody wants to believe that this thing that we really want, or my friend who's running this GB is going to screw me. And so I'm not saying you do, but many people do say when moderators try and proactively give warnings, hey, you're power tripping, man. What are you doing? Yeah. Right? And so look, I get it, right? Moderators are not elected representatives here to save the people. So fair game. You want to be pissed off they're trying to warn you, right? Fine. But, it's good. It's not bad intent on the moderator's behalf either. And so we have created this situation. Okay, where anyone can come and become a vendor and run multiple parallel group buys with virtually zero capital investment, throw up a Shopify site or whatever, go and collect hundreds of thousands of dollars, and fail. And all of the alarms and accountability is gone because of this. So what do we do about this?
That's
right?
The big question.
Right? Nobody's getting paid to solve this problem. But to those of us who feel like, hey, we have a decent community here. Of course, as it grows, there's toxic people and scams and stuff. But generally, it's a good community, right? Like for the size of this community, it's pretty decent. It's a pretty decent community. We have good people in it. How do we preserve that? And it's great, like as a capitalist myself, it's great that there's opportunity for artisans and vendors and designers and everybody to make money. Great, okay? How do we do it in a way that's sustainable? How can we minimize another Mechs Co? We're in a downturn right now. At some point, we'll get out of the downturn, and at some point, there will be another run up to 2 million members in the hobby, okay? Now, when that happens, if we have the same situation, okay, when the subsequent downturn comes, which it will, there's a lot more money and people that will be exposed if we don't make some changes. So the question is now not to look back, not to cast blame, not to scream at Mechs Co, scream at the mods that have paused the group buys and all these things, but as a community, try and figure out what can we do about this, right? And there's no easy answer. It's evolved to this because, you know, this is how the organism has organically grown, right? There's no easy answer. So one of the things you alluded to earlier is some of the moderators across different platforms have reached out to vendors to say, hey, let's try and create some guidelines, okay? Let's try and create some voluntary guidelines, at least to solve this last bullet, which is if I'm a new vendor and I come in, hey, what should I be doing? What are the best practices, right? How do I make sure I don't run too many simultaneous GBs, that I don't, you know, I'm not unaware of the risks in GBs that elongate the process where I may need more financial buffer? What's my how do I have to communicate to the hobbyists? Like we have vendors that can't even do the basics of run and update, right? They can't even give an update in GroupBot, right? Which further exacerbates the problem and creates more risk and all sorts of things, right? And so if we can start at least with some guidelines that vendors should follow, okay? And for the vendors that follow it and are good, behave well towards the community and follow these things, there should be incentive, right? And the incentive might be continued access to free marketing or some sort of designation that these are vendors that are voluntarily following a good standard, right? And for those who don't, we're not gatekeepers, right? You can do what you want. It's a free world, but you're not entitled to free marketing on the platforms. So you may not get it.
Yeah. I wonder, because we have things like mechgroupbuys.com, like Mech Calendar that track, you know, live products. But if someone had just like kept a visual timeline of like, this is the vendor,
good point.
These products are outstanding.
Yeah.
Like we could have caught this way on earlier.
So it's a good point, right? So one of the bullets I mentioned was lack of centralized visibility, right? So there are these sites that show, you know, I'll call them aggregator sites, right? That show like what are all the group buys running. Some of them focus on keyboards, some of them key sets, and some do both. Absolutely, you know, one of the potential outcomes or suggestions from this, in addition to a set of guidelines, might be, hey, we're going to have a centralized site where we track we have like the track record of GBs and vendors, right? So if there's you know, I'd like to join this group buy from this vendor, I can go back and see, hey, what other group buys has this vendor run? How long did they take? Were there any problems, right? What other simultaneous group buys are they running, and all of those things, right? That certainly could be one of the, you know, infrastructure, things that we come together as a community to do. And another one could be like, if you consider Mechs Co, right? If you're a brand new vendor, right? Because we also have to be careful as we build these guidelines, not to create like antitrust issues, if you want, or create hurdles to. We don't want to like protect large vendors at the expense of small ones, right?
Right.
While also making sure that we don't allow small ones to become a Mechs Co situation, right? So for example, if you're a brand new vendor, you may have free access to do your marketing, but you may be limited in the number of simultaneous GBs you can market until you have a track record. So maybe you can market 5 GBs, but you can't do the 6th because you still haven't fulfilled any of them. Whereas today, you could literally run 50 simultaneous GBs and no one would be the wiser. Right? There's nothing structurally to prevent that.
All right.
And I'm not saying that we will create a structure to prevent that, but we can at least create an environment where people are aware of the risk of that and make it less easy to allow unscrupulous vendors to exploit the situation. So those are and it's not easy, right? And everyone's like, naturally existing, and most vendors are are good, well-intentioned people. They're delivering on their promises, right? They're going through a difficult time, and still we had, you saw the announcement from Canon Keys from UPass, right? They're stepping in to help, pick up the shit that fell apart, right? With Mechs Co. And so everyone's trying to do the right thing, right? Mm-hmm. And naturally they're worried that, hey, if we create these standards, like, how, are they going to be onerous, right? Like, how do you protect the confidentiality and proprietary information of a vendor while providing transparency? It's a difficult balance. This is not something that can be created by one group of people. It has to be a voluntary effort across all these people, right? Vendors, designers, influencers, moderators, etc., maybe manufacturers, who knows, right? That creates an environment where we can still have this great free market capitalism and everybody getting what they want and everybody making money fulfilling it, while at least mitigating some of the risks that caused Mechs Co.
This kind of leads into something else, though. I think group buys will always still be a thing, right? Like, especially if you're an individual that doesn't want to work with a vendor, like group buys are kind of the only way. But we have these big established business vendors now.
Yeah.
Do you think, there's no way to implement it, but.
Do you want the official or my official or a personal stance on this?
Whichever one you prefer. Because I'm of the opinion, like, now we're at the point where, like, some of these vendors don't really need to run group buys anymore. Like, they should be at the point where they can, they should be making smart business decisions. Yeah. And if the product does well, then that's on them.
Drug addicts should stop using drugs too. Why don't they just stop using drugs?
They're addicted,
right? It's a fair point. And look, personally, as somebody who is an entrepreneur, right? Many a times have I been tempted to become a keyboard vendor, because this to me is a very unique situation in this market that essentially allows for a risk-free business to start. It's risk-free, virtually risk-free, okay? It's not to say that there isn't hard work. I don't want to belittle or minimize the amount of work it still takes to build a big commercial business in the space. It takes work and effort, right? But you're not going out and raising capital from investors, reporting to a board, having fiduciary oversight, paying interest on those loans, right? You don't have any of those traditional things that you do in other businesses. So on the left here, this is the intent of what a group buy was for. On the right, generating millions and millions of revenue is not what the intent of a group buy was. To be fair, that on the right was not what the group buy intent was, right? So should businesses maybe start with group buys and then work to achieve a point where they're sustainable and can invest and pre-invest in their own? Absolutely. Is there an incentive for them to do that? There isn't today. There is no
Really?
incentive
I
for
would
them to
think
do
there
that.
is. Because, like, let's say you're I mean, let's say one of the big vendors, I won't name anyone, but like, they come out and say, oh, this product, it's already paid for, it's already made, it's in stock. And like that becomes their sustained business model forward. I think they would have a huge positive, like, public image with customers as well. And be like, oh, yeah, they don't run group buys anymore.
They can do that today with the money of the consumer by funding the group buy.
I mean, right now, yes, but like, is that sustainable long term is what I'm getting at. Like, if you want to become the next level vendor.
Right. That I can't answer about the future, right?
Mm-hmm,
Is will it continue to be sustainable? I don't know, right?
mm-hmm,
But there's no signs that the group buy model is going away right now, even in this downturn, right? So I think we have to operate, if we're going to try and figure out how do we mitigate risk, we have to do it under the assumption that the group buy model will continue, right? It would be my hope, like to your point, that if once vendors get large enough, they don't need to do it. But I don't know if we'll get there or not, right? And some of these things are so niche, like highly customized keyboards and things like, we're talking generically about group buys. I think it might happen based on the product, right? So
sure.
certain products, maybe it'll get to the point, and I know some vendors are like pre-funding, keyboard kits and stuff. It's great to see that happen, right? They're in-stock items that people can buy. And so it might happen that group buys become maybe less popular or less utilized over time for certain products, right? Maybe.
Yeah. And I think this situation also raised an interesting light from like the manufacturer side as well. Like I would have assumed that,
Yeah,
at the position GMK is in,
yeah.
at some point they would have been like, okay, like you need to stop placing orders with us until you pay off the remaining.
Yeah, I think it makes sense on the surface. Intuitively, that makes sense. But if you think about them as a business that are serving not just vendors in our hobby, but other commercial entities, they're just looking at orders coming in, right? They don't really know the details of like, hey, is the person who placed the order, running their operations in a way that's risky? They don't even do that for their own. Like to be fair, it's not the role of a manufacturer to police that, right? And as I said, even if they happen to know it, it's hard. There's no formal method where they can disclose that information in a way that doesn't, create business issues for them, right? It's part of this environment we've created where there isn't a way to do that. Now, GMK happens to have a liaison in the community who we're also talking with and who will be part of these discussions. And maybe there are certain vendors, where at least we can open some channels to make sure that, if there's early warnings that can come up, maybe we can do that. But we have to be, again, careful to honor the confidentiality and relationships between vendors and manufacturers. Like who would they go to? That would be a third party to report a problem, right? About one of their customers. So it's not an easy, yes, it makes sense in theory. In practice, it's much more difficult to implement something. But absolutely, there's a reason why they're on the list, right? Is like they're a factor, right? They're a variable, right? So if I were to like, kind of indicate kind of who the big players are, right? It's like you've got vendors, you've got manufacturers, you've got designers, you've got influencers, and you've got moderators. Maybe there's some others, but I think these are the big ones, right? So these 5 parties, right? What can they do, right, to ensure, or at least to mitigate some of the risk in the future? There's no easy answer. Nobody's paying anybody to come up and solve this problem. There's no money involved in solving it. There's no financial reward. You're going to piss people off attempting to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no upside personally to anyone to do this. But, if you believe in that people all have good intention and there are people that love this community, they're going to try and at least volunteer some time to see if something can be done.
Yeah, it'll be a slow cultural community shift that needs to happen.
And it cannot happen through one group. It has to be like these groups working together. And I'm confident in, you know, that all these groups, you know, generally want to do the right thing. And if we, you know, there's no downside to doing the right thing. That's the other thing, right? Like if we can create a sustainable, you know, way that you can continue this, then it only helps the vendors, right? Nobody wants to create like uncertainty in the market. Right?
Yeah.
So I think there's plenty of upside to doing it, even though it you know, might require some compromise here and there.
Yeah. And I feel like nowadays more than ever, people definitely have become more vocal if they do see something that's wrong or maybe not looking right. Sometimes a little too vocal, but I think
there's always that. And part of, and by the way, part of it is like, look, how do we create some systems or processes where we can channel that so that it doesn't create toxicity? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like, if you feel like there's a vendor that's abusive, right? Or a moderator that's, or whatever, like we're talking generally about vendors, but you brought up the moderator thing early. Like those are examples where we need more mature processes in the hobby to address those things so that they don't become toxic issues.
Yeah.
Right. I think that, you know, we don't need formal processes for things, for all these things. And I do believe in the community is a really good way of self-correcting and fixing issues on its own, especially with respect to like scammers and people like that, right?
Yeah.
But I think Mechs Co is proof that we can't prevent everything.
For sure.
Right? And so what can we do to augment our organic safeguards with a little bit more formalized ones?
Yeah. Well, I know you've been kind of talking with the other moderators of the platforms. Mm-hmm. Do you guys currently have like a Google Doc or anything for like submissions from community members?
Yeah, we have something that we're circulating internally. It's very, very early drafts. And as you can imagine, a lot of the initial stuff is going to be just figuring out with vendors what's even feasible. Right? So it's eventually going to get to the point where we'll open it up for public commentary, but it's too early now because everything's probably going to change in there. So we have to first come to an agreement with vendors, right, as to what's feasible, not just for a big vendor, but for a new vendor. Like you could, you know, the danger in creating these things, standards in general or regulations, if you want to call it that, right? We're not creating those, but if you look at the regulations world, and I've been involved in standards creation, it's very easy to create something that's overly onerous that sort of protects entrenched existing players.
Right.
And we want to avoid that too, right? Like we're not, the intent of this is not to identify who the good vendors are and put something in place that just preserves their business. That's not the intent. We want to still have anyone who should want to become a vendor should be able to become a vendor, right? And how do we create guidelines and things to help them be good vendors that grow? Today, there aren't any, right? So today, they can, through their own efforts, become a good vendor, or they can flounder, right, and make mistakes and compounded errors and end up like Mechs Co. So how, can we, are there, again, at a minimum, can we create some voluntary guidelines for new vendors to follow so that they know what it means to become a good vendor or what they should do to, become a good vendor, right? Even though some of these things may be obvious, right? Sometimes you need to be explicit.
Yeah. That would be great if there's more educational stuff. I feel like it's surprising that we're still lacking some very basic needs.
And I think this goes back to how fast the hobby grew, right? Like, it could be that, were it not for the pandemic and this growth phase, we may have eventually arrived there in a more sustainable way, possibly, right? But, it happened the way it happened. And look, I mean, again, I think generally we have to be, this is a negative situation we're talking about. We have to look at all the positives from where we've come, right? Like, and I've heard stories from people who were before me, like, I know some people long for nostalgic days where, the good old days where everybody, but look, if you're coming in to as a hobbyist now, the amount of, product that's available, choice, options, cost, all of that is phenomenal compared to what it was even 5 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So there's a lot of positives, great vendors out there, great ones that are stepping in to help. Who, I'll name a couple of them, right? Novel Keys, Canon Key. I mean, great vendors, right? So this is, I think it's easy to look at the negative. I think what we have to recognize is generally there's been positive, and what can we learn from the positive, right? To bolster things up in the community so that we can hopefully minimize some of the negative.
I mean, even when I started, like group buys kind of were an exciting thing to join. It wasn't always this bad thing,
Absolutely. I mean, these products in the early days would not exist were it not for the
without
smart,
group buys.
right?
Yeah, and
Right.
like just going through your slideshow and talking with you kind of made me remind myself of like the early day group buys where, like it was fun to join a group. It was exciting
Yeah.
to see like that price break go down as you hit
Yeah.
certain MOQs, and everyone was like, yeah, like can we get 2 more to
Yeah.
like hit the next MOQ break? And there
Right.
was like a funness in like that early day
Absolutely.
hobbyist
Like, are we
mentality
going to
to it.
hit it? Are we going to make it? Right.
Yeah.
I think drop created the concept of the dropping, of the
Right,
of the
yes.
price lowering. These hobbyist ones, I don't think it lowered the price points. I can't remember. Maybe some did, but even just will we hit it? Right. And
Yeah.
at some point, which is a very interesting, because the minimum order quantity was a way of like. It was like an evolutionary mechanism that would prevent things that really weren't, the demand wasn't there from coming to place. But it's sort of like we bastardized that by artificially taking capital and hitting the MOQ, right? And these people were hoping that they would be able to profit off of the extras or pre-orders, even though even in a large market, the demand wasn't there to hit MOQ.
All right.
Right? These were clear indicators, right? Like if you keep plowing in money to hit MOQs of group buys in a market that was growing exponentially, something is wrong. Right? You should not have run that key set. That key set was supposed to fail.
And then they just pumped
You
money into it.
kicked the failure down the road. Right? And then you added compound risk by running multiple of those key sets that didn't have the demand.
Right. To pay for the previous one that
To pay for the previous, and some vendors, by the way, again, I say it's a miracle we didn't have more of these earlier. Some vendors, were running GBs to essentially fund the previous ones.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's, hopefully we'll get out of that, right, in this downturn. But we have to think of, ways collectively to try and mitigate this problem, because if we don't, the next group, massive run up, which there will be much more devastating when the corresponding downturn follows it, which will happen. It's cyclical. You and I may not be in the hobby. You may not be in the hobby then, but there'll be a lot more people with a lot more money, and the collateral damage will be much greater.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? So what can we do collectively, right? So I would ask for people who are upset about this, pissed off at the vendors who may be pissed off at the moderators for pausing it, like just de-escalate, and nobody has bad intent, right? Nobody has bad intent. Have a little patience, and let's trust that collectively we can work something out that is better for the community overall.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. It's already been an hour, so thank you so much for all this.
Thank you for look. You're a pillar of the community, and
I'm old news now.
you're the OG old news then, and so I think you reach a big audience, and I appreciate you giving some time to this.